"I'm their mom," the little girl told the millionaire visiting her house. Then she reveals something shocking to him, and moments later, comment giving a rating from 0 to 10. For my story, your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I count on your help. The scream sliced through the muggy afternoon air in the historic town like a blade, echoing through the cobblestone streets at precisely 3 o'clock. The 52-year-old businessman nearly dropped his coffee cup as he stepped away from the window of his luxury apartment. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity. For 3 weeks straight, that sound had been coming from the colonial house across the street, a 2-story, faded yellow building with peeling blue shutters that contrasted sharply with the elegance of the modern condo building where he lived. "Must be a kid's tantrum," he muttered to himself, adjusting his tie before returning to work. As the owner of the largest construction company in the region, he was used to solving complex problems, but he preferred to stay away from other people's dramas. Especially after living alone for 5 years. Ever since he lost his wife on a rainy night, he preferred not to remember. His fortune, accumulated through stock investments, had grown exponentially in recent years, but money hadn't filled the void in his heart. Across the street, inside the colonial house, the 4-year-old girl huddled in the corner of the kitchen, her small, thin arms unable to comprehend why her aunt hated her so much. The 38-year-old woman firmly held a metal spoon that she had heated on the wood-burning stove, her eyes red from the booze, fixed on the child trembling before her. "You're a plague on this house," the aunt hissed, her voice slurred from the moonshine she had been drinking since noon at the local dive bar. "Because of you, my sister is gone. Because of you, I lost everything." The spoon came down hard on the girl's small arm, leaving a red mark that would join the other scars that dotted her fragile limbs. The child bit her lip to keep from screaming louder. She had learned that screaming only enraged her aunt more, who had worked at City Hall until she was fired for constant absences caused by her addiction. The girl closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's soft voice, singing that lullaby before bed. It was all that was left of her now, fragments of memories and a melody that insisted on echoing in her mind during the most painful moments. "Stop whimpering," the aunt grunted, putting the spoon back in the drawer as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Go to your room, and I don't want to see you until tomorrow. And if you get those dirty charcoal drawings on the walls again, you'll see what real punishment is." The girl ran to the small room in the back of the house, a stuffy space with an old bed and a crucifix on the wall. There she curled up in the thin sheet and began to hum her mother's song softly, the only thing that still comforted her. She didn't know that across the street someone had finally paid attention to that melody. The businessman stopped reviewing the contracts when he heard the faint but distinct sound. He knew that song. His wife used to sing it when she cooked, a popular tune about free birds. But where was it coming from? He approached the window again, his eyes scanning the facade of the colonial house. One of the back windows was ajar, and from there came that childish voice, trembling but persistent. For the first time in 3 weeks, he felt something other than simple annoyance. There was something in that voice that struck a sensitive chord in his chest, something that reminded him of responsibilities long buried under layers of work and isolation. Next door to the colonial house, the 61-year-old retired teacher watered her begonias when she heard the girls singing. During her 40 years teaching elementary school, she had developed a sixth sense for children in distress. And that voice carried a pain that made her heart ache. "That's strange," she thought, observing the windows of the neighboring house, a family she had known for decades. The aunt had always been troubled, but since she took custody of her orphaned niece, something had changed in the air of that house. The girl never played in the yard, never ran through the streets like the other kids in the historic town. The teacher dried her hands on her apron and made a decision. The next morning, she would pay a courtesy visit to her neighbor. It had been a long time since she had had a proper conversation with her, and maybe it was time to get to know the little girl better. Meanwhile, the businessman remained at the window, an uncomfortable feeling growing in his chest. The song had stopped, but something in those few minutes had awakened memories that he preferred to keep dormant. Memories of a former employee who had resigned abruptly 5 years ago, a few months before the accident involving his wife. That employee was a gentle woman, always humming as she organized the construction company's files. Then, suddenly, she had simply disappeared from his life, leaving only a formal resignation letter and many unanswered questions. He had never thought about her again until he heard that familiar song echoing from a house where a child seemed to suffer in silence. The sun began to set over the mountains surrounding the town as the girl finally fell asleep, exhausted by pain and fear. Her small fingers clenched the sheet, and in her dreams she flew like the birds she secretly drew on the kitchen walls with pieces of charcoal found in the yard. Across the street, the businessman closed the curtains and tried to return to work, but he couldn't concentrate. Something had changed that afternoon, something he didn't yet fully understand. For the first time in years, he felt that maybe it was time to pay attention to what was happening beyond his own windows. Night fell on the historic town, but the echo of that childish song continued to resonate in the mind of a man who had spent 5 years running away from his responsibilities. The next morning brought the aroma of fresh bread from the local bakeries and the typical hustle and bustle of the historic town awakening for another day. The retired teacher put on her best floral dress and combed her grey hair with extra care. There was something in that child's voice that wouldn't leave her alone, an echo of hopelessness that she recognized from her years as an educator. At 9 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the door of the colonial house. The sound echoed through the silent interior until shuffling footsteps approached. The aunt opened the door with a puffy face and red eyes, clearly suffering the effects of the previous night's drinking binge. "Good morning," the teacher said with her gentlest smile. "I've come to pay a courtesy visit. It's been so long since we've had a proper conversation." The aunt hesitated, running her hand through her disheveled hair. "Oh, Mrs. Davison, it's not a good time. The house is a mess." "Nonsense, dear. We've been neighbors for so long." The teacher took a step forward, forcing the woman to back up. "And I would love to meet your niece. I hear she's a lovely little girl." The aunt's face hardened for a moment, before forcing a weak smile. "The girl is sick, high fever. Best not to get close." At that moment, a soft noise came from the kitchen, the sound of something being dragged on the floor. The teacher pricked up her ears, immediately recognizing the sound of a child trying to move silently. "Maybe I can help," the teacher insisted. "I have experience with sick children. I raised 3 kids. You know how it is." "No need, no," the aunt replied quickly, blocking the entrance with her body. "I already took her to the doctor. It's just a flu. It'll pass soon." The teacher noticed the woman's nervous hands, the way she avoided eye contact, and especially the strong smell of alcohol that emanated from her even so early. All the signs she had learned to recognize during decades of dealing with troubled families. Across the street, the businessman watched the scene from his window while eating breakfast. He had woken up earlier than usual, disturbed by confused dreams where a child's voice mixed with memories of his former employee. When he saw the teacher at the door of the colonial house, a strange curiosity washed over him. The teacher finally said goodbye to the aunt, but not before casting an investigative look at the interior of the house. There was something deeply wrong there, and her experience told her that a child was suffering. As she walked back to her house, she decided that she needed to find a way to verify her suspicions. Inside the colonial house, the aunt slammed the door shut and headed to the kitchen, where she found the girl crouched behind the table, trying to hide. The child had tried to reach a glass of water from the sink, but her height didn't allow it. and she had knocked over a chair in the process. "Didn't I tell you to stay in your room?" the aunt snarled, her irritation intensified by the hangover and the unexpected visit. "I was thirsty, Auntie," the girl mumbled, her big eyes fixed on the floor. "Thirsty?" The aunt laughed bitterly. "You want water? Then go get it from the backyard. And since you like to make so much noise, you can stay out there until I decide you can come in." The girl went out to the small backyard, a space surrounded by high walls and dominated by a single apple tree. There she sat on the ground and began to draw with a piece of charcoal she had found near the wood-burning stove. They were always birds, small, large, some flying, others perched on imaginary branches. Each stroke represented her dream of freedom, of flying away from that house where pain was her only constant companion. The hours passed slowly. The aunt had locked the back door, leaving the girl in the yard under the hot midday sun. The child began to feel dizzy, but she knew that knocking on the door would only result in more punishment. So she began to sing her mother's song softly, the melody being her only source of comfort. It was this melody that reached the businessman's ears again. This time he couldn't ignore it. There was something too familiar about that voice, that specific song. He picked up his cell phone and, almost without thinking, began to record. He didn't know exactly why, but an instinct told him that he might need that evidence. As he recorded, fragments of memories began to fit together in his mind. His former employee hummed that same song while she worked. An employee who had been exemplary until she disappeared abruptly, a woman who always spoke fondly about her little daughter, a girl named her daughter, the businessman muttered, his cell phone trembling in his hands. His former employee's daughter was named exactly as he had heard the aunt scream a few times. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. The child suffering in the house across the street was the daughter of his former employee, the gentle woman who had worked for him for 3 years before simply disappearing. How hadn't he made that connection before? The businessman put away his cell phone and began to pace back and forth in his apartment. He vaguely remembered his employee mentioning family problems, a sister she didn't get along with, financial difficulties. But he was so absorbed in his own problems at the time, the growing conflicts with his wife, the problems in the company, that he hadn't paid proper attention. Now, 5 years later, the employee's daughter was across the street, and from the sounds coming from that house, she wasn't in a good situation. The guilt that the businessman carried for the loss of his wife multiplied, now including regret for not having helped when she clearly needed it. At 3 in the afternoon, punctually, the screams started again. This time, the businessman didn't step away from the window. He watched with growing horror as, through the kitchen window of the colonial house, he saw a female silhouette moving aggressively. He picked up his cell phone again and began to record, this time with more determination. What he saw through the cell phone screen made him nauseous. The aunt was holding something in her hands. It seemed to be a kitchen utensil, and gesturing violently toward a small figure that he could barely distinguish. The girl's screams echoed through the afternoon, and this time the businessman couldn't pretend they were just childish tantrums. When the silence returned, he remained at the window for a few more minutes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just witnessed something that would change everything. His stock investments and all the wealth accumulated over the years seemed insignificant in the face of that brutal reality that unfolded a few feet away. The question now was, what would he do with this information? That night, the girl slept on the floor of the backyard, where the aunt had left her as punishment for making too much noise during the afternoon. The child curled up in her own t-shirt and looked at the stars through the branches of the apple tree. In her 4-year-old mind, she made a silent wish to her mother, wherever she was, that someone, anyone, would take her out of that place of pain. Across the street, the businessman couldn't sleep. tormented by the certainty that he needed to act, but paralyzed by the same emotional inertia that had consumed him since his wife's passing. And in the middle of the night, a decision began to form in his mind, a decision that would put at risk the entire orderly life he had built. 3 days had passed since the businessman discovered the child's identity, and guilt consumed him like a slow fire. During these days, he had systematically documented the episodes of violence, always at 3 in the afternoon, always with the same methodical brutality. His collection of videos and audios grew, but his courage to act remained paralyzed by the same cowardice that had haunted him since the night he lost his wife. On that Thursday morning, the teacher made a decision that would change the course of everything. She had spent the night awake, tormented by the certainty that a child was suffering a few feet from her house. Her 4 decades as an educator had taught her to recognize the signs, and all of them were present in the colonial house. She decided to approach the situation differently. Instead of attempting a new direct visit to the aunt, she opted for a more subtle strategy. At 7 in the morning, she positioned herself in the side yard of her house, the place where she had the best view of the backyard of the neighboring house. What she saw horrified her. The girl was sitting under the apple tree, completely alone, wearing only a torn t-shirt and underwear. Her small arms were marked by evident burns, some still red and inflamed. The child was drawing on the ground with a piece of charcoal, creating shapes that the teacher recognized as birds. "My God," the teacher whispered, her hands trembling as she held the fence that separated the yards. It was worse than she imagined, much worse. The girl looked up and saw the lady watching her. For a moment, the two stared at each other in silence. Then, to the teacher's surprise, the child smiled, a weak but genuine smile, and waved shyly. "Hi, Grandma," the girl said with her tiny voice, using the affectionate term she gave to all elderly ladies. "Hi, sweetheart," the teacher replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Are you okay?" The girl looked quickly at the windows of the house before answering. "I'm fine, I'm just drawing birdies." "That's nice. Do you like birds?" "I like them a lot. They can fly wherever they want," the child replied, her big eyes shining with a sadness that broke the teacher's heart. At that moment, the aunt's rough voice echoed from inside the house. "Where are you, girl?" The terror that instantly took over the child's face said everything the teacher needed to know. The girl got up quickly, wiped her hands on her t-shirt, and ran into the house, but not before looking once more at the educator with an expression that screamed for help. The teacher remained in the yard for a few more minutes, processing what she had seen. The burns, the fear, the way the child reacted to the aunt's voice, everything confirmed her worst fears. She couldn't pretend she didn't know what was happening anymore. Meanwhile, across the street, the businessman had witnessed the entire interaction. Through his window, he could partially see the yard, and the sight of the marks on the girl's arms made him sick. For the first time in 5 years, he felt a genuine fury burning in his chest. His former employee had trusted him in some way. Even if indirectly, even if he didn't know it at the time, she had left her daughter in the care of a family that lived in the same town where he lived. And now that child was being tortured while he watched from his comfortable window, paralyzed by his own cowardice. At 11 in the morning, the teacher made a courageous decision. She put on her best dressy clothes, took a tray of homemade cookies she had prepared as a pretext, and headed again to the colonial house. This time she wouldn't take no for an answer. The aunt answered the door reluctantly, clearly annoyed by the neighbor's insistence. "Mrs. Davison, I already told you it's not a good time." "Dear, I brought some cookies I made yesterday," the teacher interrupted firmly, "and I insist on getting to know the little one better. As old neighbors, it's our duty to support each other." Before the aunt could protest, the teacher had already entered the house, using all the authority that decades of classroom experience had given her. The interior of the colonial house was dark and smelled of mold mixed with alcohol. Old and poorly maintained furniture occupied the room, and there was a heavy atmosphere that made the air seem difficult to breathe. "The girl is sleeping," the aunt lied, blocking the way to the back of the house. "That's a shame. Maybe some other time then," the teacher said. But her experienced eyes had already catalogued several disturbing details. Dark stains on the kitchen floor that seemed to have been poorly cleaned, a metal spoon left on the stove, and especially small charcoal drawings on the walls that had clearly been made by a child. At that moment, a low sound came from the direction of the kitchen, a muffled sob, almost imperceptible. The teacher and the aunt froze. The silence that followed was tense and revealing. "Must be the neighbor's cat," the aunt said quickly, but her voice trembled slightly. The teacher smiled and nodded, but had decided she had seen enough. "Well, I'll let you rest then. But remember that I'm always here next door if you need anything. Anything at all." The educator's tone made it clear that it wasn't just a casual offer of help, it was a subtle but direct warning. After the teacher left, the aunt slammed the door shut and headed to the kitchen, where she found the girl curled up behind the wood-burning stove, trying to hide. The child had cried upon hearing the teacher's gentle voice, remembering the kindness she had once known. "You were making noise," the aunt accused, her eyes already gleaming with familiar fury. "No, Auntie, I didn't make noise," the girl protested, but her small voice sounded weak even to her. The aunt grabbed the metal spoon that was on the stove and placed it directly on the flame. The girl recognized the ritual and began to tremble. She knew what was coming next. "You want to get attention, don't you?" the aunt hissed as the spoon heated up. "You want the neighbors to come here and ask questions? You think I don't know how to take care of you?" Across the street, the businessman had positioned his cell phone at the window and was recording again. This time, he managed to capture not only the sounds, but also partial images through the kitchen window. What he saw made him make a decision that would change everything. He couldn't be just a silent observer anymore. His former employee had been a good person, a dedicated employee who always talked about her daughter with love. That child was his responsibility now, whether he wanted it or not. While the girl suffered another episode of systematic torture, the businessman made a call he hadn't made in months. He called his personal lawyer and old college friend. "David, I need your help with a delicate situation," he said, watching through the window as the girl's screams echoed through the afternoon. "It's about a child, and I think it may be a matter of life." On the other end of the line, the lawyer was surprised. He knew well the emotional isolation that his friend had built after the loss of his wife. Therefore, the urgent phone call intrigued him. "Tell me exactly what's going on," the lawyer said. "You talked about a child in danger, but I need details. The girl who lives in the house across the street is the daughter of a former employee of mine. She's being mistreated by the aunt who takes care of her." "Mistreated how?" "Burns, daily screams, neglect." The businessman paused, struggling with the words. "I have recordings, evidence of what's happening." The lawyer was silent for a moment, processing the information. "This is very serious. If you have evidence of child abuse, you need to contact the appropriate authorities immediately." "I know," the businessman replied, running his hands over his face. "But there's something more. She worked for me for 3 years. She left abruptly 5 years ago, a few months before the accident with my wife. I never understood why. But now you feel responsible," the lawyer completed, understanding the emotional complexity of the situation. The businessman nodded, even knowing that his friend couldn't see him. "If I had paid more attention at the time, maybe I could have helped. All my wealth, all the profits I've accumulated in these years, and I couldn't see the suffering of someone who was so close." That night, after the aunt fell asleep drunk on the living room sofa, the girl managed to slip silently into the backyard. Her new burns stung, but the physical pain was less than the pain in her heart. She sat under the apple tree and looked at the stars, humming her mother's song softly. What she didn't know was that for the first time in months, someone was truly paying attention to her suffering, and that a storm was about to form, a storm that would change her life in unimaginable ways. The lawyer arrived at the businessman's apartment on Friday morning with a grave expression on his face. The two men had been colleagues at university almost 3 decades ago, and the lawyer knew well the emotional isolation that his friend had built after the loss of his wife. Therefore, the urgent phone call the night before had surprised him so much. "I need you to tell me exactly what's going on," the lawyer said, sitting in the spacious living room of the apartment. "You talked about a child in danger, but I need details." The businessman poured coffee and positioned himself near the window, the place that had become his obsession in recent days. "The girl who lives in the house across the street is the daughter of a former employee of mine. She is being mistreated by the aunt who takes care of her. I have recordings, evidence of what's happening," he continued, picking up his cell phone. The lawyer watched the videos in growing silence, his face paling with each scene. As a specialist in family law, he had seen many cases of child abuse, but something in the systematization of that violence deeply disturbed him. "We can't wait any longer. I need you to give me all these recordings today. I'm going to contact Child Protective Services and the District Attorney's Office. This child needs to be removed from that house immediately." As the two men planned the intervention, across the street, the girl was living another day of terror. The aunt had woken up with a particularly severe hangover and discovered that there was no more alcohol at home. Her irritation multiplied when she found new drawings of birds that the girl had made on the kitchen wall during the night. "How many times do I have to tell you not to dirty the walls?" the aunt shouted, holding the girl by the arm tightly enough to leave marks. "You're a plague, a curse on this house." The girl tried to explain, to say that she had dreamed of her mother and that the drawings made her feel less alone, but the words were lost in sobs. At the age of 4, she still didn't fully understand why her aunt hated her so much, why each day brought new pain. "You're going to be locked in the room until I decide what to do with you," the aunt continued, pushing the child down the hallway. "And if I hear even a noise, you'll experience a punishment you've never experienced before." The room where the girl was locked was small and stuffy, with only a high window that she couldn't reach. There, she curled up in the corner and began to sing her mother's song softly, the melody being her only source of comfort in a world that seemed to have forgotten that she existed. It was this song that Mrs. Davison heard as she passed by the neighbor's house on the way to the market. The educator had spent the entire night thinking about the conversation with the girl in the yard, about the marks she had seen on the child's arms, about the atmosphere of fear that permeated that house. The teacher stopped in front of the gate and listened. The girl's voice was weak, but filled with a sadness that made the educator's heart break. At that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going to the market, the teacher went directly to downtown, where the small office of Child Protective Services was located. She knew the counselor well, a former student of hers who had dedicated herself to protecting vulnerable children. "I need to talk to you about a very serious situation," the teacher said, entering the office without ceremony. The counselor looked up from the papers she was analyzing. "Mrs. Davison, it's good to see you. What brings you here today?" "A child in danger, my neighbor. I'm sure she's being mistreated." The counselor straightened in her chair, her expression immediately becoming serious. During her 5 years as a Child Protective Services counselor, Sarah had learned to recognize when a report was serious, and Mrs. Davison wasn't the type of person to make frivolous accusations. "Tell me everything," Sarah said, grabbing a complaint form, while Mrs. Davison was recounting her observations. Across town, the lawyer was in a similar meeting at the district attorney's office. The DA listened attentively as David presented the evidence collected by the businessman. "That's compelling evidence," the DA said, examining the videos on David's cell phone. "I'll order an immediate investigation and request the child's removal from the home." How long will that take? David asked, worried. With this evidence, we can act today, the DA replied. I'll contact Child Protective Services now. Thus, by a coincidence that would change the girl's destiny, two simultaneous reports reached Child Protective Services on the same morning. Sarah was finishing writing down Mrs. Davison's account when her phone rang. Child Protective Services, this is Sarah speaking. I need you to make an urgent intervention at a house on Main Street. We have evidence of serious child abuse, the DA said on the other end of the line. Sarah paused, her pen suspended over the paper. Is it by any chance the yellow colonial house? Exactly. How did you know? I just received a report about the same house, Sarah replied, looking at Mrs. Davison with surprise. Two independent sources. This confirms the seriousness of the situation. At 2 in the afternoon, a coordinated operation was being set up. Sarah, accompanied by 2 social workers and a court officer, was heading towards Main Street. Mrs. Davison had offered to accompany the team, using her experience with traumatized children. The businessman watched everything from his window, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, after days of paralysis, he had managed to act. David was by his side, both witnessing the moment that would change the girl's life forever. You did the right thing, David said, placing his hand on his friend's shoulder. I hope it's not too late, the businessman replied, his eyes fixed on the team approaching the colonial house. All his wealth in financial investments, his investments in funds and stocks, seemed insignificant in the face of that decisive moment. At the house, the aunt had gone out to buy booze at the local dive, leaving the girl locked in the stuffy room. The child continued singing softly, unaware that her life was about to change radically. When Sarah knocked on the door of the colonial house and received no answer, she used her legal authority to enter the property. What they found inside surpassed even their worst expectations. A dirty and poorly maintained house, a strong smell of alcohol, and evident signs of neglect in every room. It was Mrs. Davison who first heard the faint voice coming from the room in the back. Someone's here, she said, guiding the team down the hallway. When they opened the door to the room and found the girl curled up in the corner, singing her sad song, everyone present felt a pang in their heart. The child raised her big, frightened eyes, not understanding who those people were or what they wanted from her. Hi, sweetheart, Sarah said, crouching down to be at the child's height. My name is Sarah. We've come to help you. The girl looked at Mrs. Davison, recognizing the kind lady who had talked to her in the yard. A glimmer of hope shone in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by fear. Auntie's going to be mad, she whispered. You don't have to worry about that now, Mrs. Davison said, reaching out to the child. We're going to get out of here, okay? The girl's departure from the colonial house was a moment that would be etched in the memory of everyone present. The child firmly held Mrs. Davison's hand, her steps small and hesitant as she crossed the door that had been her prison for so many months. Her big eyes scanned the streets of the historic town as if she were seeing the world for the first time. Where are we going, Grandma? The girl asked, using again the affectionate term she had given to Mrs. Davison. To a safe place, sweetheart, the teacher replied, squeezing the little hand gently. A place where no one will ever hurt you again. Across the street, the businessman watched the scene through his window, a mixture of relief and anxiety consuming his chest. Finally, after days of torturous inaction, he had managed to do something concrete. But now a new concern haunted him. What would happen to the girl from here on out? And then, in that moment of apparent victory, something unexpected happened. The aunt returned from the dive earlier than expected, and upon seeing the commotion in front of her house, began to scream hysterically, accusing everyone of conspiracy and trying to recover the child by force. What should have been a simple rescue turned into a chaotic scene that drew the attention of the entire neighborhood, and the businessman realized that his decision to help had only begun a battle much more complex than he had imagined. If you liked this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment on what you thought of my story, giving a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.